17 years ago, my father screamed those words that still echo in my nightmares. I was 23, standing in our family kitchen, trying to protect someone I loved more than my own life. Dad saw only shame and betrayal, but he never knew the real truth behind what he was witnessing. Last week, after nearly 2 decades of complete silence, he showed up at my front door with my stepmother and half-brother, demanding to meet their grandson. When they saw what awaited them inside my home, their faces drained of all color, and they froze in absolute speechless shock. The secret that destroyed my family started with Sarah Morrison, a 19-year-old girl whose father happened to be my dad's most important business partner. Frank Morrison owned half the construction projects in our county, and his partnership with Carter Construction had been feeding our family for over a decade. Sarah was supposed to be untouchable, the golden daughter of our town's wealthiest family, but what nobody understood was the nightmare she lived behind those mansion walls. I first noticed the bruises on a warm Tuesday evening in June. Sarah and I had been dating for about 6 months, keeping things quiet since our families moved in such different social circles. She was working part-time at the local library while taking community college classes, and I was learning the construction business from my father, Robert Carter. We were sitting in my pickup truck outside Mel's Diner on Highway 12, sharing a chocolate milkshake and talking about her plans to transfer to a 4-year university. That's when I saw them. Purple fingerprints wrapped around her left wrist like a bracelet of pain. When I asked about them, Sarah's entire demeanor shifted. Her bright smile vanished, her shoulders tensed, and she pulled her sleeves down quickly, claiming she'd bumped into a door. But I'd seen enough injuries on construction sites to recognize deliberate grip marks when I saw them. "Sarah, somebody hurt you," I said quietly, setting down the milkshake. "Tell me who did this." She shook her head, frantically, tears starting to pool in her green eyes. "It's nothing, Alistair. Really. I'm just clumsy sometimes." But over the next few weeks, I started noticing more signs. She flinched whenever someone approached her quickly. She always insisted on meeting me away from her house. She had bruises on her arms that she covered with long sleeves, even during the hottest days of summer. Most telling of all, she never wanted to talk about her family, always changing the subject whenever I brought up her father or asked about family dinners. The truth finally came out 3 months later, on a cold September night, when Sarah called me crying at 2 in the morning. I found her sitting on a bench in Riverside Park, wrapped in an old jacket, shivering more from emotional trauma than from the autumn chill. Her face was streaked with tears, and there was a fresh bruise on her cheek that she hadn't been able to hide with makeup. "He's been hurting me since I was 15. She whispered the words barely audible over the sound of the nearby creek. "My own father. And now I'm pregnant, and I don't know what to do." The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Frank Morrison, the man who shook hands with my father every Sunday after church, who donated thousands to local charities, who was respected throughout our community as a pillar of moral strength, had been sexually abusing his own daughter for years. And now, Sarah was carrying his child, terrified of what he might do if he discovered her condition. "How long have you known?" I asked, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. 6 weeks, she sobbed. "I kept hoping it wasn't real, but the test confirmed it yesterday. If he finds out, he'll either force me to get rid of it, or he'll—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but I understood the implications. Frank Morrison was a powerful man with connections throughout the state, and Sarah had no proof of the abuse beyond her word against his. "We're going to figure this out," I promised her that night, though I had no idea how. "I won't let him hurt you anymore." Looking back, I realize that was the moment my old life ended. From that point forward, every decision I made was about protecting Sarah and the innocent child she was carrying. I knew it would probably cost me everything, but some things are more important than personal comfort or family approval. Some secrets are worth keeping, no matter the price. The next few months were a delicate balancing act. Sarah continued living at home while we planned her escape, but Frank Morrison was becoming increasingly suspicious of her behavior. She was sick every morning from pregnancy symptoms, which he attributed to stress from college. She was distant and moody, which he blamed on teenage rebellion. But I could see the fear growing in her eyes every day, the knowledge that her secret was becoming harder to hide. By December, her pregnancy was starting to show, and we knew we were running out of time. Sarah had been accepted to a university 3 states away for the spring semester, and we planned to use that as our cover story for her departure. I had been saving every penny I earned working for my father, building up enough money to support her and the baby until we could figure out a permanent solution. What we didn't anticipate was Frank Morrison's unexpected visit to our house on a snowy January morning, or the chain of events that would destroy my family forever. The knock on our front door came at 7:30 on a Saturday morning, while my stepmother Linda was making pancakes and my half-brother Tommy was watching cartoons in his pajamas. Dad answered the door in his bathrobe expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery, but instead found Frank Morrison standing on our porch with fury radiating from his entire body. "We need to talk, Robert," Frank said, pushing past my father into our living room without invitation. "It's about your son and what he's done to my daughter." I was upstairs getting dressed when I heard Frank's booming voice, but the rage in his tone made my blood run cold. Sarah's pregnancy was barely visible under loose clothing, but somehow her father had discovered the truth. I rushed downstairs to find Frank pacing our living room like a caged animal, while my father stood frozen still holding his coffee cup. "Your boy has been sneaking around with Sarah for months." Frank continued, his face red with anger. "Now she's pregnant, and she's telling me all kinds of crazy stories about running away and not wanting the baby. Your son has corrupted my daughter's mind, filled her head with nonsense about leaving home and abandoning her family." Dad's eyes immediately found mine as I appeared at the bottom of the stairs. The disappointment on his face was devastating, but not because he was angry about the pregnancy. Robert Carter was a businessman first and foremost, and I could see him already calculating the financial implications of this confrontation. "Frank, let's sit down and talk about this calmly," Dad said, setting down his coffee with shaking hands. "I'm sure we can work something out." But Frank Morrison wasn't interested in calm discussion. He was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his world, and his daughter's pregnancy represented a loss of control that he couldn't tolerate. More importantly, he was using this situation as leverage to renegotiate his business relationship with Carter Construction. "There's nothing to work out," Frank declared. "Either your son takes responsibility for his actions and marries Sarah immediately, or I'm pulling out of every contract we have together. The shopping center project, the new subdivision, the municipal building renovation, all of it. My lawyers will find reasons to break every agreement if this situation isn't resolved to my satisfaction." The shopping center project alone was worth $1.2 million to our family business. The subdivision development would bring in steady income for the next 5 years. Frank Morrison wasn't just threatening to end a business partnership. He was threatening to bankrupt the Carter family completely. Linda appeared in the doorway, her face pale as she absorbed the conversation. Tommy had stopped watching cartoons and was peeking around the corner, sensing the tension, even though he couldn't understand the adult complexities involved. Our entire family's future was being held hostage by a man who was angry that his daughter might escape his abuse. "Dad, I need to explain something," I said, stepping forward. "This isn't what Frank is making it sound like. Sarah is in trouble, and she needs our help. There are things you don't understand about her situation." But Robert Carter wasn't listening to explanations. He was watching 17 years of hard work and financial security crumbling before his eyes. Frank Morrison controlled too much of the local construction business, had too many connections with city planners and zoning committees. Losing his partnership would mean starting over from nothing, and Dad was 52 years old with a second family to support. "I don't want to hear excuses," Dad said sharply. "You're 23 years old, Alistair, old enough to understand the consequences of your actions. If you got this girl pregnant, then you need to make it right." But that's not what happened. I insisted, feeling the walls closing in around me. Frank Morrison isn't the man you think he is. Sarah is scared of him for good reasons, and if we force her to marry me just to satisfy his demands, we'll be putting her in even more danger. Frank's eyes narrowed dangerously at my words. Are you implying something about my character, boy? Because I've been nothing but generous to your family over the years? My business has kept food on your table and paid for that truck you drive around town. The threat was unmistakable. Frank Morrison was reminding my father exactly who held the power in their relationship and what would happen if the Carter family chose to side against him. Dad understood the message perfectly, and I watched his expression harden as he made his choice. Alistair, you're going to apologize to Mr. Morrison right now, Dad ordered. Then you're going to call Sarah and arrange a proper wedding as soon as possible. This family doesn't run away from responsibility. I'm not running away from anything, I replied desperately. But I can't marry Sarah under these circumstances. She needs protection, not another man controlling her life. If you would just listen to what I'm trying to tell you about her father. Enough. Dad's voice exploded through our living room, silencing everyone. I don't want to hear another word of this nonsense. Frank Morrison is a respected member of this community and a trusted business partner. If his daughter is pregnant, and you're the father, then you're going to marry her and provide for that child properly. That's the end of this discussion. The ultimatum was brutal in its simplicity. Abandon Sarah to her abusive father and agree to a forced marriage that would trap her permanently or lose my family forever. Frank Morrison stood there smirking, knowing he had orchestrated the perfect manipulation. Either way, he would regain control of his daughter and punish her for trying to escape. I can't do that, Dad, I said quietly. I won't sacrifice Sarah's safety for your business contracts. Robert Carter's face went completely cold. The man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and taken me to baseball games looked at me like I was a stranger who had invaded his home. In his mind, I was choosing some girl over my own family's survival, throwing away everything he had built for the sake of teenage rebellion. Then you're no son of mine, he said with finality. Pack your things and get out of this house. Don't come back until you're ready to act like a man instead of a foolish boy. Linda gasped and reached toward me, but Dad's glare stopped her from interfering. Tommy started crying, confused by the sudden explosion of adult anger. Frank Morrison nodded with satisfaction, knowing he had successfully destroyed any chance of my family supporting Sarah's escape from his control. I went upstairs and packed my few belongings, while my family sat in stunned silence below. 3 pairs of jeans, some work shirts, my high school graduation photos, and the small amount of money I had saved from construction jobs. Everything else, I was leaving behind my childhood bedroom family dinners, the security of belonging somewhere in the world. When I came back downstairs with my duffel bag, Dad was waiting by the front door. He didn't say goodbye, or wish me luck, or offer any final words of advice. He simply opened the door and waited for me to walk through it, severing our relationship with the same business-like efficiency he applied to construction contracts. The last thing I heard before the door closed behind me was Tommy calling my name through his tears, and Linda whispering apologies that would never be enough to bridge the gap that had just opened in our family. Sarah and I found a tiny apartment on the south side of town, 800 square feet of worn carpet and peeling wallpaper that cost $600 a month plus utilities. It was all I could afford on the wages from my part-time construction work, since most of the major contractors in our area were connected to Frank Morrison's business network. Word had spread quickly that I was persona non grata, the ungrateful son who had betrayed Robert Carter's friendship with one of the community's most powerful men. The apartment was on the second floor of a converted house with thin walls that let us hear every argument and television show from our neighbors. The kitchen had outdated appliances and a refrigerator that made grinding noises all night long. The bathroom had a shower that only produced lukewarm water, and the heating system was so unreliable that we often wore coats inside during the coldest weeks of winter. But it was ours, And more importantly, it was safe. Frank Morrison didn't know where we were living, and Sarah was finally free from the constant fear that had dominated her life for years. For the first few weeks, she seemed to blossom in the security of our little sanctuary. She would wake up smiling, help me plan our budget, and talk excitedly about baby names and nursery decorations. Sarah was 5 months pregnant when we moved in together, and watching her body change was both wonderful and terrifying. I had no experience with pregnancy or babies, but I read every book I could find at the public library and asked questions of the older women who worked at the grocery store where Sarah had found a part-time job. We attended free prenatal classes at the community health center, where a kind nurse named Mrs. Patterson taught us about nutrition and breathing exercises. The pregnancy progressed normally, but Sarah's emotional state was more complicated. Some days, she was optimistic and energetic, making plans for our future and talking about how much better our child's life would be than her own childhood. Other days, she would fall into dark moods, staring out the window for hours without speaking, or waking up in the middle of the night from nightmares about her father finding us. I was working 3 different jobs to keep us afloat financially. Construction work during the day paid the best, but it was irregular since many contractors were reluctant to hire someone who had fallen out of favor with Frank Morrison. I stocked shelves at a 24-hour grocery store from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, then caught a few hours of sleep before heading to whatever construction site would have me. On weekends, I did landscaping work for homeowners who advertised in the classified section of our local newspaper. The schedule was exhausting, but I was motivated by the knowledge that Sarah and our baby were depending on me. Every dollar I earned was a step toward building the stable life that Sarah had never experienced. We furnished our apartment gradually, with items from yard sales and thrift stores, creating a home that was humble but filled with hope and determination. David was born on a rainy Thursday morning in April, after 18 hours of labor at County General Hospital. Sarah was incredible during the birth, stronger and braver than I had ever imagined possible. When the doctor placed our son in my arms for the first time, I felt a surge of love and protectiveness that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. He was perfect, 8 pounds 4 ounces of pure potential with Sarah's green eyes and a stubborn chin that reminded me of my own baby pictures. For the next few weeks, our little family seemed complete. Sarah was recovering well from the delivery, and she appeared to be genuinely happy as she learned to nurse and care for David. We took turns getting up for nighttime feedings, and during the day, we would sit together, watching our son sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes, dreaming about his future. I had found more steady work with a small contracting company that specialized in residential repairs, and the owner, Jake Sullivan, didn't care about my problems with Frank Morrison. Jake was a former Marine who judged people by their work ethic rather than their family connections, and he appreciated my willingness to take on any job, no matter how difficult or dirty. But Sarah's good mood didn't last. As David grew more alert and demanding, she began showing signs of the depression and trauma that years of abuse had created in her mind. She would sometimes stare at the baby with an expression of confusion, as if she couldn't understand how he had come to be part of her life. Other times, she would cry for hours, holding David tightly, while whispering apologies that I didn't understand. The breaking point came on a warm morning in late May, when David was 6 weeks old. I had worked the overnight shift at the grocery store, and came home around 7 in the morning expecting to find Sarah feeding the baby and getting ready for her part-time shift at the library. Instead, I found our apartment empty, except for David, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib. On the kitchen table was a handwritten note that shattered my world. Alistair, I can't be the mother he needs. Every time I look at David, I see his grandfather's face and remember things I'm trying to forget. The memories are too strong, and I'm afraid I'll hurt him somehow. Please give him the life I never had. I'm sorry for everything. I love you both, but I have to go. Don't try to find me. Sarah. I read the note 3 times before the reality sank in. Sarah was gone, and I was suddenly a single father with no family support, limited income, and a 6-week-old baby who depended on me for everything. David woke up crying, hungry for his morning feeding, and I realized I didn't even know how to prepare a bottle of formula. The next few hours were a crash course in single parenthood that nothing could have prepared me for. I called in sick to work, spent the day learning how to mix formula and change diapers properly, and tried to figure out how I was going to manage childcare while working enough hours to pay our bills. Mrs. Patterson from the health center helped me locate a subsidized daycare program for low-income families, and Jake Sullivan adjusted my work schedule so I could drop off and pick up David every day. Meanwhile, Frank Morrison was spreading rumors throughout our community that I was an irresponsible deadbeat who had abandoned my girlfriend and child. He told anyone who would listen that Sarah had run away because I was abusive and controlling, unable to provide properly for a family. According to his version of events, I was exactly the kind of young man that parents warned their daughters to avoid. Nobody knew the truth about Frank Morrison's abuse of his daughter, or Sarah's psychological trauma, or my desperate attempts to protect both her and David. In the court of public opinion, I was guilty of every accusation Frank leveled against me, and there was no way to defend myself without revealing secrets that could destroy whatever chance Sarah had of building a new life somewhere else. So, I focused on what I could control, being the best father possible to David, working hard enough to provide for our needs, and proving through my actions that Frank Morrison's character assassination was wrong. Some battles are fought with words and legal documents, but others are won through years of quiet persistence and unwavering dedication to doing the right thing. David became the center of my universe, the reason I got up every morning, and the motivation for every decision I made. Every milestone in his development was a victory against the people who had written us off as failures. Every smile, every first word, every step forward was proof that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. Those first years as a single father were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. David was an easy baby in many ways, sleeping through the night by 3 months and developing quickly. But the logistics of working multiple jobs while caring for him alone required careful planning and incredible stamina. I would drop him off at Little Angels Daycare at 6 in the morning, work construction until 3 in the afternoon, pick him up and spend time together until 8 in the evening, then head to my overnight security job at Pinnacle Financial Services downtown. The security job was supposed to be simple: walk the building every hour, check doors and windows, make sure no unauthorized people were in the offices after business hours. But it was during those quiet nights, sitting at the reception desk between rounds, that I discovered my true calling in life. The financial advisors and investment analysts who worked at Pinnacle often left documents on their desks, or in wastebaskets, reports and prospectuses and market analyses that they considered routine paperwork. I started reading everything I could find, partly out of boredom and partly out of curiosity, about how wealthy people made their money. I learned about price-to-earnings ratios and dividend yields, about real estate investment trusts, and municipal bonds, about the difference between growth stocks and value investing. Most importantly, I began to understand that money wasn't just about working harder. It was about making smart decisions with whatever capital you could accumulate. My first investment was embarrassingly small, $50 in a mutual fund that focused on utility companies. The financial advisor whose office I was cleaning had written a memo about how utility stocks provided steady dividends and long-term growth potential, and I figured that $50 was a risk I could afford to take. 6 months later, that investment had grown to $62, and I was hooked on the concept of making money work for me instead of just working for money. David was 2 years old when I made my first real estate purchase, a foreclosed duplex on the east side of town that was selling for $18,000. The property needed extensive renovation, but I had learned enough about construction from working with Jake Sullivan to handle most of the repairs myself. I spent weekends and evenings gutting the interior, replacing plumbing and electrical systems, painting, and installing new flooring, while David played with his toys nearby. The duplex became our home and our first source of rental income. We lived in one side, while I rented out the other half for $450 a month, which covered our mortgage payment and provided a small profit. More importantly, it taught me about the power of leveraging debt to acquire assets that would appreciate over time. David was incredibly intelligent, even as a toddler. He learned to walk at 10 months, started speaking in complete sentences before his second birthday, and showed a natural curiosity about everything around him. While I was renovating the duplex, he would hand me tools and ask endless questions about how things worked. When I was reading financial documents in the evenings, he would sit on my lap and point to numbers trying to understand what they represented. "Dad, why are you always reading about money?" He asked one night when he was 3 years old, looking up from his picture book about dinosaurs. "Because I want to make sure you have everything you need," I explained, lifting him onto my knee. "And because money can help us help other people who are in trouble like we used to be." By the time David started kindergarten, I owned 3 rental properties and had built a substantial investment portfolio. I was still working construction during the day and security at night, but the passive income from my real estate holdings was beginning to provide financial stability that I had never experienced before. More importantly, I was starting to see the bigger picture of how wealth could be created and accumulated over time. David's kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was the first person outside our little circle to recognize his exceptional abilities. She called me in for a conference after the first month of school to discuss moving him to a more advanced academic program. David was reading at a 3rd grade level, solving mathematical problems that challenged students twice his age, and demonstrating creative thinking skills that impressed even veteran educators. "Your son is remarkably gifted," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, as we watched David help younger children with their alphabet worksheets. "Have you considered having him tested for the Accelerated Learning Program? With the right educational environment, there's no limit to what he might achieve." I enrolled David in every enrichment program I could afford. Piano lessons on Saturday mornings, where he quickly surpassed students who had been playing for years. Swimming classes at the YMCA, where his natural athleticism and competitive spirit made him a standout performer. Academic tutoring in mathematics and science, where he absorbed complex concepts with ease and enthusiasm. But the most important lessons David learned weren't from textbooks or teachers. They came from watching me work 12-hour days to provide for our family, from helping me maintain our rental properties, from accompanying me to the bank when I was negotiating loans for new acquisitions. He understood that success required sacrifice, that respect was earned through consistent effort, and that financial security came from making smart decisions over many years. When David was 7 years old, I started Carter Investment Group with an office in a converted warehouse downtown. My reputation as a reliable contractor had helped me identify undervalued properties throughout the region, and my self-taught expertise in financial analysis allowed me to make profitable investments that more educated people had overlooked. I hired 3 employees, a secretary, an accountant, and a junior analyst who had graduated from the state university with a degree in finance. David would visit the office after school, doing his homework at a small desk I had set up in the corner, while I worked on acquisition proposals and financial projections. He was fascinated by the business side of real estate, asking questions about market trends and cash flow analysis that demonstrated an intuitive understanding of economic principles. "Why do you buy buildings that other people don't want?" he asked one afternoon, looking over a spreadsheet that showed the projected returns on a small apartment complex I was considering. "Because most people only see what something is right now," I explained, pointing to photographs of the rundown property. "But we look at what it could become with the right improvements and management. Sometimes the best opportunities are hidden in places where other people see only problems." By David's 10th birthday, Carter Investment Group had grown into one of the most successful real estate companies in our region. We owned 47 rental properties, had completed 12 major renovation projects, and managed real estate portfolios for several high-net-worth individuals who had heard about our track record through word of mouth. Our annual revenue had reached the multi-million-dollar range, and my personal net worth had grown beyond anything I had imagined possible when I was sleeping on the floor of that first apartment. But financial success was never the real goal. Every property I acquired, every business relationship I developed, every dollar I earned was motivated by my determination to provide David with opportunities that had been denied to his mother. I wanted him to grow up knowing that he could achieve anything through hard work and smart decisions, that he never had to depend on anyone else for his security or self-worth. David was thriving academically, socially, and athletically. He was the top student in his fifth-grade class, captain of his swim team, and the youngest pianist ever accepted into the regional youth orchestra. More importantly, he was developing into a kind, thoughtful, and confident young man who treated everyone with respect and empathy. The contrast between David's life and the childhood his mother had endured was staggering. While Sarah had grown up in fear and isolation despite her family's wealth, David was surrounded by love and encouragement while experiencing genuine financial security. He understood that our success had been earned through years of sacrifice and intelligent planning, not inherited or achieved through exploitation of others. On David's 11th birthday, as we celebrated with a small party at our home, I realized that I had accomplished something far more valuable than financial success. I had proven that it was possible to build a meaningful life from nothing but determination and love, that family wasn't defined by blood relationships or social status, but by the bonds of mutual support and shared values. The best part was knowing that this was only the beginning of David's story, and that all the wealth and opportunities I had created would serve as a foundation for achievements that would far exceed my own. David was 16 years old, a junior at Jefferson High School, where he maintained a 4.0 grade point average while serving as student body president and captain of the varsity swim team when my past finally caught up with our present. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in October, and I was reviewing financial statements in my home office while David practiced piano in the living room. The music floating through our house was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece that would challenge most adult pianists, but which David played with the emotional depth of someone twice his age. The doorbell rang at exactly 3:45, interrupting both David's practice session and my concentration on quarterly profit reports. We weren't expecting visitors, and most of my business associates knew to schedule appointments at my downtown office, rather than disturbing our home time. I walked to the front door, assuming it was probably a delivery driver, or perhaps one of David's classmates stopping by to work on a group project. Instead, I found myself face to face with Tommy Carter, my half-brother, who I hadn't seen or spoken to since that terrible morning 17 years earlier, when our family had imploded over Frank Morrison's ultimatum. Tommy was 33 years old now, no longer the frightened teenager who had watched me pack my belongings and leave forever. But he looked older than his years, with premature gray streaks in his brown hair and worry lines around his eyes that spoke of financial stress and disappointment. "Hello, Alistair," Tommy said nervously, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn jacket that had seen better days. "I know this is unexpected, and I wouldn't blame you if you slammed the door in my face, but we need to talk." My first instinct was exactly what Tommy had predicted. The Carter family had chosen Frank Morrison's money over my welfare 17 years ago, and they had never made any attempt to contact me during the years when David and I were struggling to survive. Now that I was successful, they suddenly wanted to reconnect. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient. But curiosity won out over anger, at least temporarily. Tommy looked genuinely nervous rather than arrogant, and there was something in his expression that suggested desperation rather than opportunism. I stepped aside to let him enter our foyer, noting how his eyes widened as he took in the marble floor crystal chandelier and original artwork that decorated our home's entrance. "Nice place," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and something that might have been shame. "You've done well for yourself." David appeared at the top of our grand staircase, having heard the doorbell and come to investigate. At 16, he was already 6 feet tall with the lean build of a competitive swimmer and the confident bearing of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His resemblance to me was unmistakable, but there was something in his green eyes that reminded me painfully of his mother. "Dad, who's visiting?" David asked politely, demonstrating the excellent manners that had been drilled into him since childhood. "This is Tommy Carter," I replied carefully. "My half-brother." David's expression immediately became more interested. He knew the basic facts about my family situation, that I had grown up with a father and stepmother who had rejected me during a difficult time, and that he had relatives somewhere in the area whom he had never met. But we rarely discussed those relationships in detail, since there had never been any contact or apparent interest from either side. "Tommy, this is my son David." I continued watching as my brother's face registered surprise at the young man's obvious intelligence and maturity. Tommy extended his hand toward David, who came down the stairs and shook it with the firm grip and direct eye contact I had taught him years ago. "It's nice to finally meet you, David. You look a lot like your father did when he was younger." "Thank you, sir," David replied with genuine warmth. "Dad's told me about his family, but he said you might not want to maintain a relationship because of old disagreements. I'm glad you decided to visit." The simple honesty of David's response seemed to hit Tommy like a physical blow. His composure cracked slightly, and I could see tears forming in the corners of his eyes as he realized what kind of relationship he had missed over the years. "We should talk privately." I suggested, leading Tommy into my study, while David returned to his piano practice. The music resumed as we settled into leather chairs beside the fireplace, the complex melodies providing a sophisticated soundtrack for what I suspected would be a very complicated conversation. My study reflected the life I had built over the past 17 years. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes on finance, real estate, and business strategy awards and certificates, recognizing my contributions to various charitable organizations, photographs of David's academic and athletic achievements. The contrast with Tommy's obvious financial struggles couldn't have been more stark. "He's incredible," Tommy said, gesturing toward the living room where David was playing. "I mean, I knew you had a son, but I didn't expect—" "How old is he?" 16. I replied, settling back in my chair and studying my half-brother's face for clues about his real motivations. "He'll be starting his senior year next fall, then heading to Harvard, where he's been accepted into their early admission program." "Harvard," Tommy repeated, shaking his head in amazement. "At 17 years old. That's extraordinary." "David is an extraordinary young man." I agreed. "But I'm guessing you didn't drive across town just to meet your nephew. What do you really want, Tommy?" Tommy's nervous fidgeting increased, and he spent several seconds staring at his hands before finding the courage to look me in the eyes. "The family's had some rough times since you left Alistair. Dad's business collapsed about 5 years ago when Frank Morrison got arrested for tax evasion and money laundering. Turned out, he'd been using their construction projects to hide income and launder cash from some pretty shady sources. The revelation about Frank Morrison's criminal activities wasn't entirely surprising, since men who abuse their own children rarely limit their unethical behavior to family relationships. But the news that his downfall had destroyed Robert Carter's business was more interesting, representing a form of poetic justice that I hadn't expected. Dad had a heart attack when the FBI raided his office," Tommy continued. "Lost everything in legal fees, and back taxes, had to sell the house and most of his equipment. Mom's been working at Target for the past 3 years, trying to pay for his medications and therapy. I've been helping as much as I can, but I'm barely keeping my own head above water." The picture Tommy was painting was clear enough. The Carter family was broke, desperate, and looking for a financial lifeline from the son they had abandoned nearly 2 decades earlier. It was almost funny how money changed people's perspectives on family loyalty and moral principles. "And you thought I might be willing to help?" I said, not bothering to hide the skepticism in my voice. "We heard about your business," Tommy admitted. There was an article in the newspaper about Carter Investment Group donating money to build a new children's wing at the hospital. Mom saw your picture and realized how successful you've become. She's been wanting to reach out for months, but Dad's too proud to admit he made a mistake. So they sent you instead, I concluded. Actually, they don't know I'm here, Tommy said quickly. This was my idea. I've been thinking about you for years, wondering what happened after you left. When I saw that newspaper article and realized you were still in town, still using the Carter name for your business, I thought maybe there was a chance we could be a family again. The sincerity in Tommy's voice was unmistakable, but it was also irrelevant to the larger situation. Even if his personal motivations were genuine, the timing of this reunion attempt was suspicious. The Carter family had shown no interest in my welfare during the years when David and I were struggling. But now that I was wealthy and successful, they suddenly wanted to reconnect. What exactly are you hoping will come of this conversation? I asked. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, listening to David's piano practice, and probably calculating how much money was represented by the artwork and furnishings surrounding us. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Dad's dying, Alistair. The doctors say he has maybe 6 months left, and he's been talking about you more and more lately. He knows he made mistakes, but he's too stubborn to admit it directly. I think he wants to meet David before it's too late, wants to try to make things right somehow. This was the emotional manipulation I had been expecting, the appeal to family obligation, and deathbed reconciliation that was supposed to overcome 17 years of abandonment and betrayal. But Tommy had badly underestimated how much I had changed since leaving our family home with nothing but a duffel bag and wounded pride. I'll consider it, I said, finally standing to indicate that our conversation was over. But any meeting would be on my terms at my convenience and with my conditions. David's welfare comes first, above any other consideration. Tommy nodded eagerly, clearly relieved that I hadn't simply thrown him out immediately. Of course, whatever you think is best. Can I give you my phone number, in case you decide you want to talk more? I took his contact information and walked him to the front door, where David appeared again to say goodbye politely. Tommy lingered on our front porch for a moment, looking back at our home with an expression of regret and wonder. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm proud of what you've accomplished. And I'm sorry it took us so long to reach out. After Tommy left, David and I sat together in the kitchen while I explained the complicated history between me and the family he had never known. David listened thoughtfully, asking insightful questions about the circumstances that had led to our estrangement and the potential risks and benefits of allowing the Carter family back into our lives. What do you think we should do, Dad? David asked finally. I think we should be very careful, I replied. But I also think you deserve the chance to meet your grandfather and decide for yourself what kind of relationship you want with that side of your family. What I didn't tell David was that I already knew about Robert Carter's terminal cancer diagnosis, his family's financial troubles, and their desperate search for ways to pay for experimental treatments that weren't covered by insurance. Information was one of the most valuable commodities in business, and I had learned years ago to stay informed about the people who had shaped my life, even from a distance. The Carter family's visit would happen on my terms at a time and place of my choosing, and it would serve purposes they couldn't possibly imagine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't direct retaliation, but simply allowing people to see exactly what they threw away when they chose money over family loyalty. 3 weeks after Tommy's unexpected visit, I arranged for the Carter family to come to my home on a Saturday afternoon, when David would be free to spend time with them without the pressure of school or other commitments. I didn't tell them about the scope of my wealth or the extent of David's achievements, preferring to let those revelations unfold naturally during their visit. Robert Carter was 71 years old now, walking with a cane and wearing the gaunt appearance of someone whose body was failing, despite his determination to remain strong. Linda looked older than her 65 years, with gray hair and tired eyes that spoke of stress and financial worry. They arrived in Tommy's 15-year-old Honda Civic, which contrasted sharply with the luxury vehicles parked in my circular driveway. David answered the front door dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt, looking every inch the confident young man I had raised him to be. His first words to his grandfather were characteristic of the empathy and emotional intelligence he had developed over the years. "Grandfather, I'm so glad you felt well enough to visit today," David said, extending his hand toward Robert with genuine warmth. "Dad's told me wonderful stories about growing up in your house and learning about construction work from you." Robert Carter's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. His eyes filled with tears as he shook hands with the grandson he was meeting. For the first time, a young man who bore such a strong resemblance to me at that age, but who possessed a sophistication and confidence that neither of us had developed as teenagers. "You're so much taller than I expected," Robert said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And you have such a firm handshake. Your father taught you well." Linda stepped forward to hug David, her own tears flowing freely as she absorbed the reality of the family relationship she had missed for 17 years. Tommy stood behind his parents, smiling with genuine happiness at seeing the reunion he had orchestrated. I led them into our living room, where David had arranged fresh flowers and prepared coffee and sandwiches for our guests. The grand piano dominated one corner of the room, surrounded by framed photographs of David's achievements and awards from various academic and athletic competitions. "This is a beautiful home," Linda said, looking around at the cathedral ceilings, hardwood floors, and expensive furnishings that reflected our family's prosperity. "You've created something really special here, Alistair." "David and I have been very fortunate," I replied diplomatically, not mentioning the years of sacrifice and hard work that had made our current lifestyle possible. "We believe in making the most of whatever opportunities come our way." Robert was studying the photographs on our mantelpiece, his expression growing more amazed with each image he examined. David receiving academic awards, David swimming competitively, David performing piano recitals, David volunteering at community service projects. 17 years of accomplishments and milestones that his grandfather had never witnessed. "David, your father tells me you're an excellent student," Robert said, settling carefully into one of our leather chairs. "What's your favorite subject in school?" "I enjoy all my classes, but I'm particularly interested in economics and business management," David replied. "Dad's been teaching me about real estate investment and financial planning since I was 8 years old. I think I'd like to expand our company's operations into commercial development when I finish college." The casual reference to our company clearly surprised the Carter family, who had assumed that David was simply a bright student with good grades, rather than someone who was already involved in significant business operations. Robert leaned forward with renewed interest, suddenly realizing that his grandson wasn't just academically gifted, but was being groomed to take over a substantial enterprise. "You work in your father's business?" Robert asked. "I have an office at Carter Investment Group, where I do homework and help with research projects," David explained. "Dad says it's important for me to understand how our investments perform and why we choose certain properties over others. Last year, I helped analyze the feasibility study for a shopping center we're developing on the north side of town." Tommy's eyes widened as he began to grasp the scope of my business operations. A shopping center development represented millions of dollars in capital investment and years of planning, not the kind of project that small-time contractors typically undertook. "How large is your company, Alistair?" Tommy asked carefully. "We manage about 200 properties throughout the region," I replied. "Residential, commercial, and mixed-use developments. We also provide consulting services for other investors who want to improve their portfolio performance." Linda gasped audibly as she processed this information. 200 properties represented tens of millions of dollars in real estate holdings, far beyond what she had imagined when she saw that newspaper article about our charitable donations. "Dad's being modest," David added with a smile. Carter Investment Group was named Regional Business of the Year by the Chamber of Commerce last month, and our charitable foundation has donated over $3 million to local schools and hospitals in the past 5 years. The revelation about our charitable giving seemed to hit Robert Carter like a physical blow. He stared at David with an expression of wonder and regret, clearly calculating the magnitude of what his family had lost when they chose to support Frank Morrison over their own son. $3 million, Robert repeated quietly. To charity. Dad always says that success means nothing if you don't use it to help people who are struggling, David explained. He started the foundation because he remembered what it was like to have no family support during difficult times. The subtle reminder of my family's abandonment wasn't lost on anyone in the room, but David delivered it without malice or anger, simply as a statement of fact about our motivations and values. David, would you mind playing something for us? I suggested, gesturing toward the piano. Your grandfather might enjoy hearing the piece you performed at the regional competition last month. David moved to the piano and began playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a challenging piece that required both technical skill and emotional maturity to perform properly. The music filled our living room with complex harmonies and powerful crescendos that demonstrated not just David's musical ability, but his capacity for artistic expression at the highest levels. Robert Carter wept openly as he listened to his grandson's performance, overwhelmed by the realization that this talented, accomplished, and compassionate young man had grown up without any input or support from his paternal family. Linda reached over to hold her husband's hand, both of them struggling to process the emotional weight of what they were witnessing. When the music ended, David returned to his seat beside me, completely natural and unassuming, despite having just delivered a performance that would have impressed audiences at Carnegie Hall. His humility was one of his most attractive qualities, a characteristic that made his achievements even more remarkable. That was extraordinary, Robert said, wiping tears from his eyes. I've never heard anything so beautiful. Thank you, sir, David replied. Music helps me think through complicated problems. Dad says it's important to have creative outlets that balance the analytical side of business and academics. Tommy was staring at David with an expression of awe and regret, clearly recognizing that his nephew represented everything the Carter family had lost through their own poor judgment. Here was a young man who embodied the best qualities of intelligence, character, and achievement raised by the son they had discarded in favor of maintaining a business relationship with a criminal. David, do you ever think about your mother's side of the family? Linda asked gently. David's expression became more serious, and he glanced at me before answering. Dad's explained the difficult circumstances that led to my birth and my mother's decision to leave when I was very young. I understand that she was dealing with trauma that made it impossible for her to be a parent at that time. I hope she found peace and happiness wherever she went. The maturity and compassion in David's response left the Carter family speechless. Here was a 16-year-old who had grown up without his mother and without his paternal grandparents, but who harbored no apparent resentment or anger about either abandonment. Instead, he spoke with empathy and understanding about the adults who had failed him, demonstrating an emotional sophistication that many people never develop. Your father has done an incredible job raising you, Robert said finally. I can see that you've grown into exactly the kind of man any family would be proud to claim. I've been very fortunate to have a dad who made my welfare his top priority, David replied, smiling at me with genuine affection. He's taught me that family isn't about blood relationships or social status, but about the people who stand by you when times are difficult and who celebrate your successes without jealousy or competition. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Robert Carter and his family had failed those basic tests of family loyalty, while I had demonstrated what true parental dedication looked like over 17 years of consistent support and sacrifice. As the afternoon continued, I took the Carter family on a tour of my business headquarters downtown, where they met my employees and saw the scope of our operations firsthand. David moved through the office with easy familiarity, greeting staff members by name, and discussing ongoing projects with the kind of detailed knowledge that impressed seasoned real estate professionals. The tour concluded with a visit to the Carter Foundation offices, where David showed his grandparents the programs we funded to help disadvantaged children access educational opportunities and escape abusive family situations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the Foundation's mission was directly related to the circumstances that had shaped both my life and David's childhood. By the time we returned home that evening, Robert Carter was exhausted but emotionally transformed. He had spent 6 hours witnessing the extraordinary life that his son and grandson had built together, and the contrast with his own family's recent struggles was devastating. "Alistair," he said as they prepared to leave, "I need to tell you something that's been weighing on my heart for 17 years. I made the worst mistake of my life when I chose business over family, when I believed Frank Morrison's lies instead of listening to my own son. I threw away the best thing I ever had, and I've regretted it every day since." It was the apology I had waited nearly 2 decades to hear, but now that it had finally come, I felt more sadness than satisfaction. Too much time had passed, too many opportunities had been lost, and too much damage had been done for simple words to heal the wounds that had shaped both our lives. But David's reaction was characteristically generous and forward-looking, focused on the future rather than dwelling on past mistakes. "Grandfather," he said, "Dad always taught me that people deserve second chances if they're genuinely committed to changing their behavior. Maybe we can't recover the time that's been lost, but we can decide how we want to move forward from here." The emotional reunion with my family was just the beginning of a much larger conversation that would reshape all our relationships and reveal truths that had remained hidden for nearly 2 decades. Over the following weeks, Robert Carter's health declined rapidly, and the weight of his regrets seemed to accelerate the cancer's progression through his weakened body. During one of our increasingly frequent hospital visits, Robert finally found the courage to ask the question that had haunted him since learning about David's achievements and our family's success. "Alistair," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to understand what really happened 17 years ago. You tried to tell me something about Frank Morrison, something I refused to hear. What was the truth I was too stubborn and greedy to acknowledge?" David was in the hospital cafeteria, getting coffee for Linda, who had been maintaining a bedside vigil for the past 3 days. Tommy was handling phone calls with doctors and insurance companies. It was just Robert and me in the quiet hospital room, surrounded by machines that monitored his vital signs and provided the medications that kept his pain manageable. I had been preparing for this conversation for 17 years, but now that the moment had arrived, I felt no satisfaction or desire for revenge. Instead, I felt only sadness for the wasted time and missed opportunities that had resulted from his refusal to listen when it mattered most. Sarah Morrison wasn't just pregnant when she came to me for help. I began carefully. She was fleeing years of sexual abuse by her own father. Frank Morrison had been raping his daughter since she was 15 years old, and when she discovered she was pregnant with his child, she was desperate to escape before he either forced an abortion or killed her to hide his crimes. Robert's face went completely pale as he absorbed this revelation. His breathing became labored, and not just because of the cancer ravaging his lungs. The magnitude of his moral failure was hitting him with devastating clarity. Frank Morrison was a child molester. I continued, "And when I tried to protect his victim, you chose to preserve your business relationship with him instead of supporting your own son. You threw me out of our family for refusing to abandon a teenage girl who was being tortured by her father." "Dear God," Robert whispered, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. "What have I done? What kind of man was I?" "You were a man who valued money more than justice." I replied without cruelty, simply stating the facts that had shaped both our lives. And Frank Morrison knew exactly how to manipulate that weakness to maintain control over his daughter and punish me for interfering. Robert was quiet for several minutes, processing the full implications of what he had learned. Finally, he looked at me, with eyes full of pain and regret. Did Sarah ever find safety? Did she escape from him? She disappeared 6 weeks after David was born, I explained. I never heard from her again, but I hope she found peace somewhere far from her father's influence. Frank Morrison told everyone in town that I was an irresponsible deadbeat who had abandoned my responsibilities, and nobody knew the real story. I helped him destroy your reputation, Robert said, his voice breaking. I believed his lies and spread them to other contractors. I made it almost impossible for you to find work in our community. I know, I said simply, but that adversity forced me to become stronger and more resourceful than I would have been otherwise. If you had supported me back then, I might have stayed in construction and never discovered my talent for investment and business development. This was the truth I had come to understand over the years. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the greatest opportunities, and the people who hurt us most profoundly end up doing us the biggest favors by forcing us to exceed our original limitations. How did you know about our financial problems? Robert asked. Tommy said he didn't tell you about my cancer diagnosis or the business collapse. Information is valuable in my line of work, I replied. I've been monitoring Frank Morrison's legal troubles for years, waiting to see how his crimes would eventually catch up with him. When the FBI investigation destroyed your business, I knew it was only a matter of time before you would need help. Robert stared at me with a mixture of amazement and shame. You've been watching over us even after everything we did to you. I've been watching over Tommy and Linda, I corrected. They were innocent victims of your poor judgment, just like David and I were. I wasn't going to let them suffer because you made bad business decisions 17 years ago. This was when I revealed the full extent of my knowledge and planning. For the past 5 years, I had been quietly paying Robert's medical bills through an anonymous foundation, ensuring that he received the best possible cancer treatment without the family knowing where the money was coming from. I had also been providing financial assistance to Tommy, helping him pay his mortgage and supporting Linda's living expenses through carefully disguised business arrangements. You've been supporting us all along, Robert said, his voice filled with wonder. I've been supporting my family, I replied. Despite everything that happened between us, Tommy is still my brother. Linda raised me for 10 years, and you're David's grandfather. Family obligations don't disappear just because people make mistakes. David returned to the hospital room carrying coffee and sandwiches, immediately sensing the emotional intensity of the conversation he had missed. Robert looked at his grandson with new understanding, recognizing not just David's achievements, but the values that had shaped his character. David, Robert said, your father is the most remarkable man I've ever known. He protected someone who needed help when he was barely more than a child himself. He built an empire from nothing while raising you alone, and he's been taking care of our family for years without asking for credit or recognition. I know, grandfather, David replied with a smile. Dad's taught me that real strength comes from helping people who can't defend themselves, and that success means nothing if you don't use it to make the world better for others. Over the following months, as Robert's condition continued to deteriorate, our families began the slow process of rebuilding relationships that had been severed by pride, greed, and misunderstanding. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension and awkwardness as we navigated the complex emotions surrounding 17 years of separation. But David's presence made everything easier. His natural warmth and emotional maturity helped bridge the gap between past hurt and future possibilities, demonstrating through his own character what could be achieved when family relationships were built on love and mutual support rather than financial considerations. Robert Carter died peacefully on a Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by his family, and finally at peace with the knowledge that his grandson was growing into an extraordinary young man. His final words to me were simple but profound. Thank you for becoming the man I should have been. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the Carter Foundation's charitable work. But the most meaningful moment came when David delivered a eulogy that honored his grandfather's memory, while acknowledging the complexity of human nature and the possibility of redemption, even after serious mistakes. My grandfather taught me that good people can make bad decisions when they're scared or desperate. David said, his voice carrying across the packed church. But he also showed me that it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and try to make things right. The best legacy we can leave behind is the knowledge that we learned from our failures and use those lessons to become better people. After the funeral, Tommy approached me with a proposal that reflected both his gratitude for my support and his desire to contribute something meaningful to our family's future. "I want to work for Carter Investment Group," he said. "I know I don't have your education or experience, but I've learned a lot about business over the past few months, and I want to help build something that honors Dad's memory and supports the foundation's work." I hired Tommy as a property manager, starting him at an entry-level position where he could learn our systems and prove his commitment to the company's values. Linda continued working at Target, but I established a trust fund that would provide for her financial security for the rest of her life, ensuring that she could retire with dignity whenever she chose. David graduated as valedictorian of his high school class and delivered a commencement speech about the importance of standing up for people who cannot defend themselves. He was accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship, but he deferred enrollment for 1 year to work full-time at Carter Investment Group and help establish our new nonprofit organization focused on supporting victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence. On David's 18th birthday, as we celebrated with Linda, Tommy, and the friends who had become our chosen family over the years, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. From the desperate young man who had been thrown out of his father's house to the successful businessman and devoted father I had become, every challenge had contributed to our current happiness and security. "Dad," David said as we watched the sunset from our back patio, "do you ever regret the choices you made 17 years ago? Do you ever wonder how different our lives might have been if you had given in to grandfather's ultimatum?" "Never," I replied without hesitation. Every decision I made was about protecting someone who needed help and building a life based on principles rather than profit. If I had compromised those values to maintain family approval, we never would have discovered what we were truly capable of achieving. David nodded thoughtfully, understanding the deeper lesson about integrity and moral courage that had shaped both our lives. "I'm proud to be your son," he said simply. As I watched David prepare for his future leadership of our family business and foundation, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't financial success or social recognition, but the knowledge that I had raised a young man who would continue fighting for justice and supporting people who needed help. The principles that had cost me my original family had ultimately created something far more valuable, a legacy of service and compassion that would outlast any material achievement. Sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly over many years, through consistent dedication to doing what's right, rather than what's easy. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge, but about proving through your actions that love and determination can overcome any obstacle. And sometimes the family you build is stronger than the one you were born into, because it's founded on choice rather than obligation. The secret that destroyed my relationship with my father ultimately became the foundation for everything meaningful in my life. Protecting Sarah Morrison led to raising David alone, which taught me the business skills that created our financial success, which provided the resources to help other families facing similar challenges. Every painful step of the journey had been necessary to reach this destination. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what you know is right? Have you experienced a situation where standing up for your principles cost you something important, but ultimately led to something better? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your story might inspire someone who is facing their own difficult decision right now. If this story resonated with you, please like this video to help it reach other people who might need to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming adversity and building meaningful success from difficult circumstances. And please share this video with friends or family members who believe in the power of perseverance and moral courage. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most challenging and rewarding periods of my life. Remember that every ending is also a beginning, and that the choices you make today will determine the story you'll tell tomorrow. Stay strong, stay principled, and never underestimate your ability to create something beautiful from the most difficult circumstances.